Konnichiwa! Do you prefer physical over digital? Then hit that like button, sit back, and let's take a look at the cartridge that saved the Sega Mega Drive and Sega Genesis. Game on! Welcome back to the Retro Game Boy channel. In today's show we're going to take a look at how a fight between Sega and EA ended up with the both of them coming out as huge winners. With some decent success with the Master System in Europe and Brazil, Sega decided that they'll go big with their 16-bit console. Sega's brand new 16-bit console would come with a ton of new innovations, including RGB output, a brand new 16-bit processor and audio processor, and actually included physical hardware backwards compatibility for their reasonably successful Master System. Sega also had a fantastic gaming strategy. They were going to take the huge success that they had in the arcades and bring those gaming experiences into the home. With Sega's brand new hardware, which in some cases was better than the competition, and its amazing back catalogue of arcade games also coming to the system, Sega turned its eyes to third-party publishing. Sega wanted to own the entire B2B model. They wanted to own everything from manufacturing all the way through to distribution. And owning that pipeline was going to be extremely lucrative for Sega. They were going to take between $10 and $15 of the total cost price. Now, to put that in perspective, a game manufacturer or games developer may sell their game to a shop for between $20 and $25. And then the rest of that markup would go to the store, which would cover their bricks and mortar costs, their staffing costs, any kind of shelf marketing costs, and then of course the profit on top of that. Which meant the original developer could end up with as little as $5 from every single game they manufactured. Now, for one third-party developer and publisher, this was just a step too far. And so EA went to Sega with a brand new royalty and publishing deal. A deal that would still see Sega receive a decent publisher royalty, but at the same time would claw back some of those profits for EA. Now, this deal just didn't work for Sega. It would mean giving up some of those huge royalties that they would get from manufacturing and distributing the cartridge. Along with that, they'd be making an exception for one of their third-party publishers that could cause them bigger issues further down the road. And so, after some heated back and forth, it's reported that Sega eventually told EA if they wanted to do this, that they'd have to back-engineer the cartridge and manufacture it themselves. And you know what? That's exactly what EA did. This audacious move by EA put Sega in an impossible position. They now had a third-party game developer and publisher with the ability to manufacture cartridges and circumvent the publishing royalties that Sega were charging for the manufacture and distribution on every single cartridge. Now, of course, Sega couldn't allow this to happen. It would destroy their business model. And so the two companies got back to the negotiating table, and Sega this time came back with a more attractive offer. A larger slice of the royalty pie, and EA would be allowed to manufacture and distribute their own cartridges. And it's this humble little cartridge here that ended up helping to save the Sega Mega Drive and Sega Genesis. And over the course of the Sega Genesis lifetime, EA would end up providing more than a quarter of the games available for the system. For Sega, this meant increased sales, a portfolio of games that covered not only arcade, but simulation, RTS, and sports, and gave Sega a gaming portfolio that would allow their 16-bit console to compete with the Super Nintendo. Sega's publishing deal would have limited EA's ability to make bigger profits and would have limited the amount of cartridges that EA could have produced. Because as Sega owned the original distribution and manufacturing process, they could actually say how many games they wanted to manufacture. The huge success of EA on the Sega Mega Drive is directly linked to the huge success that Sega had with the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis. And while it didn't win the 16-bit console, it came damn close, and a lot closer than it did with its 8-bit console. Without EA pushing on Sega for a better business deal, they wouldn't have ended up with a more cost-effective cartridge and a bigger share of the royalty pie. And without those increased profits, we probably wouldn't have had the huge gaming catalogue that EA provided the Sega Mega Drive. And without that huge gaming catalogue, the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis may not have been that successful. And without the success of the Sega Genesis, then Sega wouldn't have been set up for the battle of the 32-bit consoles. Oh dear. Let's take a look at the cartridge that changed the face of Sega and EA's fortunes.
Now that's not bad. Discover Genesis, and your world will never be the same.
Now, whilst the cartridges themselves stayed pretty much the same, the insides would differ. The PCB and ROM inside would differ from game to game. But the biggest change was in the boxes that EA manufactured. Now, one of the first boxes that EA manufactured was this cheap VHS type box. It was made of a cheaper plastic, and you can see it wasn't the same as the Sega Mega Drive or the standard Sega Mega Drive boxes that we see with all other games. It's a thin plastic with the tag here being a different shape, which often warps in the sun, and the plastic is creaky and would often split. The box itself is also larger than a standard Mega Drive box, being taller and ever so slightly wider. Now, whilst this was EA's first manufactured box, they did publish a very small number of games in the original Sega Mega Drive box. It wouldn't be long though before EA moved to the standard EA box that we all know today, with the Electronic Arts running along the bottom here and the classic yellow label on the back. And whilst this style of box would remain for EA's mainline games, they did introduce a new style for their EA Sports range. Now, the EA Sports range had exactly the same cartridge and box, but would move to this white cover for all of its EA games. Now, the standard EA cartridge is also bigger than the standard Mega Drive cartridge. It also includes this iconic yellow plastic strip down here. Now, there are actually 3 different types of cartridge, and the differences come down to the screws at the back. Now, on the older cartridge, we have the Phillips or the cross screw here. You also got this 3-groove screw here, which was on some of the cartridges, and then the more modern releases moved to this star head screw. Let's open up and have a look inside one of these cartridges. Now, this cartridge actually was damaged. I had it shipped about a month ago, and something must have hit it because it went straight through the box and straight into the cartridge, and you can hear it rattling around. Amazingly enough though, the game still works, but it just goes to show how tough these cartridges actually were. Now, as this was an earlier cartridge, it's got the Phillips screws, the crosshead screw heads in there, so we can use this bad boy to take it apart. And here we can see the inside of the cartridge. Now, in some of these games, the PCB goes a little bit higher, I guess depending on what extras they've added on there. Back in the day, my friends used to insist that this little yellow tag here on the side used to house some special technology that allowed EA games to be better than any other game. But it turns out it's just a plastic clip to hold the top together. Now, this concession by Sega to allow EA to have their own cartridge, boxes and cover art opened the door for a number of other games developers to do their own version of the cover box art and to produce their own cartridges. Virgin, Tengen and Time Warner would all go on to create their own versions of the Sega Mega Drive box art. And it would also lead to some amazing innovations on the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, with companies like Games Master creating 4-player cartridges. The history of video gaming is a weird and wonderful place, and it's a thing I love about retro gaming. And if you love retro gaming, you may want to consider subscribing to the channel by clicking on my little pixel here below. And if you don't want to miss next week's Retro Gamer Show, then you can click on the little bell below. And if next week is just too long for you to wait for retro gaming goodness? Then you can check out one of these two videos over here.